Hi, my name is Makisha Brooks. I'm one of the members of the organizing committee charged with realizing USM's 10-10-10 lecture series. This monumental lecture series, which is a product of the University of St. Maarten, seeks to foster and encourage reflection, critical thinking, and open dialogue about St. Maarten's constitutional odyssey, going from island territory within the Netherlands Antilles to country within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. In the previous lecture, we learned a great deal about St. Maarten's journey leading up to 10-10-10. This was largely due to the contributions of the lecturer, former Minister and Lieutenant Governor, Mr. Dennis Richardson. Mr. Richardson shared just a fraction of his knowledge in this area. Now, in this lecture and those to follow, we'll be going more in depth about St. Maarten's realities post-constitutional change. In this particular lecture, the conversations will be about St. Maarten's socio-economic development and growth, and the impacts that St. Maarten's constitutional change have had in these areas. At the end of the day, economic development and output help to dictate much of our lives. A well-performing economy can generate much-needed funds for investments in other areas such as schools, education, and environmental protection. For this reason, and that this topic is so big, we've actually enlisted the help of the President of the Central Bank of Curacao and St. Maarten, Mr. Richard Doornbosch. Mr. Doornbosch will be talking about St. Maarten's economic growth post-10-10-10. Following Mr. Doornbosch's presentation, we'll actually be going over to the Mèlé team, who will be doing their usual analysis and reflection about the lecture. We all live in an active economy. Each time we go to work, each time we pay for something at the counter, we are all participating in this economy. For any country, the goal should be inclusive, sustainable growth that is propelled by a well-performing economy. I hope that with this presentation, we all help to think about the ways in which we can improve St. Maarten's economy and help that to be the engine for our inclusive, sustainable growth. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed today's lecture.
Thank you for inviting me to speak in this lecture series commemorating 10 years after 10-10-10. It is a great pleasure for me to do so. St. Maarten is a young nation. It was only a decade ago that St. Maarten became an autonomous country within the Dutch kingdom. St. Maarten is also a small island state. With only 40,000 inhabitants, it sits around place 188 of the 200 or so countries of the world. And looking back over its first decade, St. Maarten has been characterized by shocks, external or natural shocks, and internal, let's say human-made or political shocks. And when drawing lessons since 10-10-10, I will argue that to deal with these shocks, we need to prepare for the first and hope to prevent the second. And the main recipe to do so is remarkably similar for both types of shocks, and that is to invest in capacity building. So let's start. Since becoming an autonomous country within the Dutch kingdom in 2010, St. Maarten has experienced two major external shocks that affected the country's economic and social situation. And the first one was Hurricane Irma, we all remember. To a lesser extent, Hurricane Maria that followed in September 2017. Both hurricanes caused massive destruction to St. Maarten's key infrastructure. Some calculations set the damage done at around 200% of GDP. And economic growth collapsed. Real GDP contracted by more than 12% in 2017-2018. The second major natural shock we are experiencing and living in right now. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic and the related containment measures that the government took in 2020. Including a border closure of approximately 3 months and a total lockdown that lasted more than 6 weeks. Both have caused an unprecedented economic crisis in St. Maarten. According to the latest projection of the CBCS, GDP will drop by almost 25% in 2020. As we see, it was not only natural shocks that hit St. Maarten. We see frequent changes in the power dynamic in the parliament. St. Maarten has had 10 different cabinets in 10 years. So on average, every year, a different and a change in government. The longest cabinet lasted only 19 months and the shortest for only 4 months. So this unusual political environment has direct macroeconomic consequences because it affects investor confidence, and through investor confidence it affects private investments, and through private investment it negatively impacts economic growth. So let's turn to economic growth. Despite major investments in key infrastructure over the past decade, in among other things the airport and the harbour, growth remained subdued between 2010 and 2019. On average, the Sint Maarten economy grew by only 0.4% between 2010 and 2019. And in this regard, on the next slide, when you compare it to the neighboring countries in the Caribbean region, Sint Maarten is lagging behind. The neighboring countries recorded an average real GDP growth of 1.1% over the same period. And meanwhile, Sint Maarten's main trading partner and its main source market for tourism, the United States, grew on average by 2.3% annually between 2010 and 2019. Let's turn to public finances. The dissolution of the Netherlands Antilles included a debt relief program that was agreed between the Netherlands and the entities of the Netherlands Antilles. And as a result, Sint Maarten went into its new constitutional status in 2010 with a sound debt position, as reflected by a low, or maybe I should say very low, public debt to GDP burden of 19%. The debt relief program was bound by strict fiscal rules. Most notably, a condition to keep current expenditure at or below fiscal revenues as stipulated in a new Kingdom Law of Financial Supervision. In this law, and in addition, the Independent Council of Financial Supervision for Curacao and Sint Maarten, the CFT, was established and assesses whether Sint Maarten meets the fiscal criteria. So this balance that is required between current revenue and current expenditure and only allows to borrow for investments is based on the so-called golden rule of fiscal policy. This golden rule states that over the economic cycle, the government will borrow only to invest and not to fund current spending. In other words, it means that on average, over the ups and downs of an economic cycle, the government should only borrow to pay for investments that benefit future generations. But the problem with the application in the Kingdom Law is that the part that says it should be on average over the economic cycle is left out. So current expenditure and current revenue should be in balance every year. Well, that is impossible if you get hit by a major shock, as Sint Maarten is frequently happens. And what you should do in that situation, the Kingdom Law doesn't specify. So leaving it up to the Kingdom Council to decide, creating a certain political uncertainty and tension within the government and between the Kingdom partners. So the implication is that over the past decade, the country has faced many difficulties with meeting these rules. It has led, amongst others, to the build-up of arrears towards the Social and Health Insurance Fund and the General Pension Fund. As a result, the country received an instruction from the Kingdom Council of Ministers in 2015 to settle its outstanding arrears. On the one hand, this design flaw in the Kingdom Law is responsible for the mixed results. On the other hand, a lack of public financial management and tax administration capacity has been an important driver and reason for the challenges that Sint Maarten faces in the area of public finances. This capacity is necessary to entertain a constructive dialogue on the course of fiscal policy when the rules of the Kingdom Law do not provide sufficient guidance. However, there's also a different way to look at this slide. Until Irma, you can see that the deficit in percentage of GDP has been very limited, and half of the time there was even a surplus. So there's also a reason to say that the glass has been half full instead of half empty. Because of the damage done to the economy caused by the hurricanes in 2017, Sint Maarten and the Netherlands agreed to use the escape clauses in the Kingdom Law on Financial Supervision. That allows for temporary deviations from the balanced current budget rule in case of a major shock. And the exception was prolonged for the current period amid the corona crisis. The public debt to GDP ratio increased from 19% in 2010 to a projected 50% or almost 50% in 2020. The increase reflects primarily a rise in the foreign debt component, and this rise was due to the issuance of bonds to finance public investments and the liquidity shortage, or the liquidity support, I should say, that the country received following the hurricanes and related to the corona crisis. Maybe a small detour to the reconstruction of Sint Maarten after the hurricanes to prove the point on the importance of capacity development. In November 2017, the Dutch government made available $550 million for the reconstruction after Hurricane Irma, to be managed by the World Bank. And as a result, in April 2018, the Sint Maarten Reconstruction and Resilience Trust Fund was established. And the disbursement of the reconstruction funds has so far been slow. And this can be ascribed to, among other things, a lack of experience with the project and procurement requirements and procedures of the World Bank, but also to a lack of absorption capacity by Sint Maarten. In particular, the absorption capacity and the capacity to deal with the financing and project management component that is inevitably going to be part of dealing with such large sums of money. So then the question is, what are we going to do? So what to do? What we need to do is to invest in resilience to deal with these shocks. And resilience building comes in three parts. First of all, diversification. Sint Maarten could become less vulnerable to shocks if it had other key economic sectors besides tourism. But this is easier said than done. It is perhaps more realistic for Sint Maarten to diversify its tourism source markets. Currently, more than 50% of the total stay-over arrivals to Sint Maarten are from the United States. And consequently, economic cycles in the United States transmit directly to Sint Maarten. And Sint Maarten should focus on a strategy to improve its tourism product and diversify to its more source markets. Second, the importance of natural disaster risk management. As a result of climate change, the frequency and severity of natural disasters in our region is projected to increase. And therefore, Sint Maarten needs to take steps proactively to identify risks associated with natural disasters and the likelihood that these may occur. Subsequently, measures should be taken to minimize the adverse socio-economic consequences of hurricanes in the future. These measures should include providing facilities to improve bank financing in the aftermath of a disaster and strengthening financial education of the population, and particularly in insurance. In addition to this, new infrastructure should be built with resilience in mind, while existing infrastructure should be built, or rebuilt I should say, to higher standards to lessen the likelihood of damage from future natural disasters. And then my main point, capacity development. Experience over the past decade shows us that capacity limitations are putting a severe strain on Sint Maarten's economic development. And this is not surprising. Sint Maarten had to start almost from scratch 10 years ago. And it is something to worry about. You need to get the basics right before you can aim higher. So you need to be able to walk before you can run. And therefore, investing in capacity development is key. This is true for many aspects of governance, but as a central banker, I limit myself to a few macroeconomic elements of governing. First, in Sint Maarten there is a need for improvement and expansion of real sector, fiscal and social indicators. Without this, it is hard to develop any credible policies. And therefore the government should put priority on improving the statistical capabilities, and also the central bank should do this, and make efforts to increase the awareness of the importance of data across all sectors of society. Furthermore, Sint Maarten would benefit from developing its own medium-term macro-fiscal framework, featuring a credible medium-term anchor and sustainable fiscal targets. This will help making responsible policy choices, it will help setting realistic budget projection, and it helps to be always on guard against various fiscal risks. Together, this would improve greatly fiscal resilience. Recently, the Central Bank of Curacao and Sint Maarten is working closely with the government of Sint Maarten to develop such a macro-fiscal framework. Let me conclude. Strong institutions are important for sustainable and inclusive growth. And even though St. Maarten started with a sound fiscal position, failure to address structural weaknesses of the economy has been an impediment to deal with the external and internal shocks to achieve a higher growth path. Addressing these structural weaknesses head-on should start with investing in basic institutions. Number one, a consistent and credible macroeconomic framework based on more and better data. Number two, strengthening the tax framework and public financial management. And finally, number three, leapfrog to a digital government that makes doing business easy. Thank you for your interest, and I very much look forward to listening to your discussion of these issues.
Okay, hello everyone and welcome to Mèlé. Today we will be commenting on the presentation by Richard Doornbosch, who is the president of the Central Bank of Curacao and St. Maarten. He gave a presentation on St. Maarten's economy since 2010. You'll notice that Ralph is missing today. He actually had an emergency dentist appointment. So we hope that he's okay and that he can join us for the next one. So be sure to show Ralph some love in the comments. Okay, so we're hoping that the presentation by Mr. Doornbosch was pretty understandable. I think he spoke in lay terms, and I think that most of the things he said were clear, but we want to sort of divide his presentation into two different parts. So the first thing we're going to be discussing is his assessment of the problem. He talked about what he sees the issue as being. And then the second thing we want to talk about is his solutions. And he talks a lot about capacity building, capacity development, St. Maarten's ability to absorb funding, and a lot of things like that. And so we're just going to get into it. Okay. So his assessment of the problem. So if you'll remember from the talk, he says that there are really two different types of shocks that affect St. Maarten and St. Maarten's economy. The first one is external shocks, and the second one is internal shocks. So he defines external shocks as being those things that you cannot control. Those are things like natural disasters. So talking about Hurricane Irma that happened, Hurricane Maria that happened, the pandemic that happened, things that come from the outside that you can't necessarily control. And then the internal shocks that he talks about are usually man-made. So that's things like the government falling 10 times in 10 years. That's things like the border closure that happened. Those are mainly political things that affect the economy. And so I think that I think he was right in his assessment. I will say that I agree with his definition of internal and external shocks. And I think that he showed data, especially for the external shocks, that I want to zoom in a little bit on because he didn't really spend much time on it. And so some of the statistics that he provided was that after Irma, St. Maarten took a hit of what some estimate to be 200% of GDP. So that means 2 times the amount of, so GDP is the gross domestic product, right? And that is the sum of all of the economic activity that a country produces in a year. So that means if 200% of the GDP was lost after Irma, that is like 2 years of St. Maarten's economy being gone down the drain in one hit, okay? The next thing he talks about was that economic growth collapsed after Irma, that real GDP contracted by more than 12% in 2018 and 2019. And he showed the graphs for those things. And so I think that graphs were very interesting to me because it seems from his graphs that St. Maarten is doing fine from 2010 up until 2016. In 2017, we have this huge shock that happens, and then it goes wonky. 2017, 2018, it's kind of crazy. But then the bounce back in 2019 is actually pretty remarkable, to only be hit again by the pandemic in 2020. And so I guess Carla and Stiffy, we were really trying to figure out, like this graph, like what's really happening here, because he talks about the external shocks and the effects of the external shocks, and we see that so clearly in the graphs. We see that we get hit by Irma in 2017, boom. We get hit by the pandemic in 2020, boom. Like that is so clear, but before that, we actually seem to be doing pretty well. Even though before that, what we were seeing was internal shocks, right? The government fell several times before 2017, right? So why are we not seeing those internal shocks being reflected in those graphs if those internal shocks actually affect the economy? And so I'm not sure if you guys want to weigh in on that.
Well, it's true that if you overlay like the GDP progression map with the map of new cabinets, it doesn't match, and so it's also what I noticed. And so it's true that we don't see clearly what would be the effects of these internal shocks on GDP. Another phenomena that I would have wished that he talked on is corruption, because there has been many allegations of corruption, and also, well, the kingdom has pushed several times for committees to regulate and stop corruption. So in my mind, it's an issue, and it must have some economic effects. So I'm no expert in economics, so I cannot provide an analysis, but as a student of the day to this lecture, I would have enjoyed more in this aspect. So I did a little bit of research, and generally speaking, corruption has a negative effect on economic development, because it raises the price of investments, and it lowers the public fund that is available to public investments. And of course, it has a negative impact on the relation between democracy and the citizens, because then the citizens are like, why should I elect people that will, well, basically take money from public funding or give money to their friends when they are looking for contractions for projects. And so even though we know that generally speaking, corruption has a negative effect on economic development, I was also wondering, in what sense, to what extent does it have a positive aspect on projects? Because to a certain extent, I believe it can work as an incentive for political actors to carry on projects, because they know that they will take out some advantage of carrying out these projects. And so there's this little bit of balance, and of course, on the ethical point of view, corruption is not something to advocate for. But maybe the relation to economic growth, project development, and corruption should be an angle that is more discussed and on which we have more data.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that, St. Maarten has been subject to a lot of different investigations in terms of corruption, and I was a little bit, I don't know if disappointed is the right word, but to me, the measures that were used, when you use GDP, just so much is hidden, and so corruption is one of those things that hides so well in GDP, because corruption doesn't necessarily affect GDP per se, because maybe corruption is actually what boost GDP, right? You have folks who know that they're going to be able to get a deal when they come to St. Maarten. So they come to St. Maarten, they get that deal, and that's what keeps our economy going. But who's actually seeing that money, and where does that money actually go? So that's definitely a super fair point to raise.
And I think commenting on that point, and something that we discussed before when we were trying to compare the graphs and the information, and when we saw this bounce back in 2019, the way that GDP can really hide inequality, and you can see it in that sense, is that you have certain sectors of the community, certain persons, certain businesses that are driving, of course, like this economic gain forward for the entire country, and it's reflected as the entire country. So we have to see that while economic growth is happening on a national scale, what percentage of the people is actually represented by that economic gain? And so GDP really hides the extremes very well, whereas in 2019, you still had some people who were unemployed, or who weren't able to repair parts of their houses still from a hurricane that happened in 2017. You had people very much on the opposite end of the spectrum who were able to advance the economy for the entire island. And so it's not, in a sense, to put these extremes against each other, but just to show the way in which GDP can hide the fact that those inequalities can actually worsen while the economy overall is getting better. And in looking over the lecture, I think the one thing that stood out for me is to try to understand, like, what are the economics of political instability? Because we were saying, you overlay the graphs, you don't necessarily see the effects GDP-wise on what a fallen government is doing. And so if you look up the definition of political instability, I think overall the accepted definition is the propensity of government collapsing. And so for us, we would measure that then by, the rate of cabinets per year. And as Mr. Doornbosch acknowledged, that's 10 cabinets in 10 years. That's one new cabinet per year. But if we also understand and measure the kind of political instability that St. Maarten has, I think that that's also important in understanding how foreign investment then either sees St. Maarten as an attractive option or not. Because we don't have a political instability that's driven by violence amongst different groups within society. We have government collapsing largely because of falling out of political alliances. And so I think when you take that into consideration of the nature of our political instability, it also helps to understand, how investors are seeing St. Maarten. But as we've been saying, and as Mr. Doornbosch also said himself, the lack of data for us to have these conversations is huge and monumental. And for us to be able to have this discussion further, we do need accurate data to be able to, because I think, and that's the discussion that we always have, there's a lot of things that we know, but what are we backing it up with? And that takes just data development on the island overall. And so when I think about the economics of political instability, I think of two things that I don't think were acknowledged that people should possibly think about. And that's one, the economic effects on public spending of political instability, and two, the effects on the human economy. And so for public spending, as already touched on a little by Steffi, is the fact that I would love the data specifically on how much it costs this country every time our government falls. And that's acknowledging the fact that sometimes ex-ministers have to stay on the payroll. It's the cost of how much time is wasted by civil servants when they have to literally reintroduce incumbent cabinets every time to the material and the work that they've been doing. Which of course is different for every minister that comes in or group that comes in. It's not always stable, but adding up all these costs of how much, and running elections however so often, how much that costs and puts a burden on public spending, how much people are still on certain payrolls because of this political instability, and what that costs the island in the end. And I think one of the main things is, not just financial, but time-wise, what goes into the switching of cabinets. That for me is something that really has to go into measuring how much is lost economically as well as socially. And for me, the effects on the human economy as well, because so from the labor force survey, the last one was done in 2018, and it said that there are, out of the roughly 40,000 people living on the island, there are 23,146 people who are part of our labor force. And of those persons, 20,850 are employed. Of those persons, 4,133 or 19.9% of those people have a degree from a tertiary education. And so when you take that into account and you take into account the fact that, first of all, politics here is driven by political allegiances, if you have to find a new minister for a position every year, the way that you're burning through your population in terms of the resources that you have to fill positions is then why we find ourselves in a situation where we're saying we don't have qualified persons to fill certain positions, because you have that tie, especially to political allegiances. And when the situation is constantly unstable, you're just burning through your minds, basically, right? And what environment are we creating to be able to foster for people to want to step into these positions, for people to want to fill these functions, for people to want to come back to St. Maarten and be able to, I'm not saying that people just be able to come back with degrees to fill positions, but, to come back, to be able to be put into functions and for those functions to be available for you to gain the necessary experience, for you to understand that when you reach a certain stature in office, that you know what to do. And I think that for me, the best person that always says this is my stepdad, and he always says that St. Maarten is just like a horribly managed company. And that's one of the ways that you can see it, because you're not putting in the right groundwork to be able to give your population the resources that it needs to be able to educate itself to reach this position. And for those of them that do, you burn through them all because you keep collapsing every year.
I'm just going to comment on the necessity of data and the nature of data. So he mentioned he uses data for his assessment, and then he says that data is important for capacity building. And so, of course, it's a huge point, data. And I do want to mention that what data does is that it helps us to diversify our sources of knowledge, meaning that when he does his presentation, what he says, we know it. We know that there's been a lot of governments, and we know that it has a detrimental effect on the people. It can have many effects, but the data gives you what things to look at more precisely. But choosing some data is not neutral, As we mentioned earlier, GDP doesn't allow us to see the distribution of the growth through the population. Also, it doesn't inform us on the education of the population, their economic means per person, or their happiness, or other index that are more and more used to assess if a population is developed.
I think that's a good segue into our next section, which is, talking about his solutions. So
I did want to mention something that you said earlier during the call preparation. That was about the countries that were made to compare, that were chosen to compare the St. Maarten's economic situation to.
Basically, I don't think the graphs that he used were super fair, to be honest. Because in the graphs that he used, he's comparing St. Maarten's economy with the US and with other Caribbean economies. And the US didn't go through Irma, and other Caribbean economies didn't go through Irma. Irma was a very small section of the Caribbean that got hit. And so if you're going to compare St. Maarten with other places, and then you're going to look at the average over the 10 years, St. Maarten's at 0.4%, and other places have much higher growth. But I mean, it's the average over 10 years, and St. Maarten had Irma, and then we had the pandemic. So it's like, of course, the 10-year is not.
Well, I guess his point is that like the US is funding St. Maarten in terms of tourism economy. So maybe the US is a fair point, but if he had compared it to like Dominica maybe, or other like islands that were touched by a big hurricane. Yes.
Or even to compare it, but then to really focus on that, because if you look at the graph before 2017, like St. Martin is pretty much doing the same as all the others. And then 2017, it's like a huge hit that others do not have. Like you don't see that dip that St. Martin has. And then St. Martin actually rises above the US and other Caribbean nations in 2019. And our economic growth is way above them. There's like a huge spike, and then 2020 just like brings it all the way back down. So I just felt like that was not super it wasn't a fair comparison in my opinion. I feel like there could have been either a shorter window, or to compare us to Puerto Rico, for example, that would have been a much more fair comparison. Puerto Rico going through Maria, and then again with the pandemic. It's just a bit more comparing apples to apples. And so,
In those situations, it's also because this is my problem with economy in general. Economy as a discipline holds a lot of factors stable while comparing the one thing that you're talking about. And for me, even if we are going to say, okay, both St. Martin went through Irma, Puerto Rico went through Hurricane Maria, but we're both part of very different political structures, right? And so the way in which we can lend, borrow, especially compared to, for example, okay, Puerto Rico might be like more on the same level as us, but a completely independent Caribbean country that could have gone straight to the IMF from the get-go, get that fund and spend that money in ways that are less controlled than we have to with the World Bank, the money from Holland through the World Bank and the NRPB. And so when you take into account all those compounding political and social factors, of course, I think it becomes very easy sometimes to tear apart like economic indicators, because economic indicators hold so much constant, and
yeah,
that's not the real world.
I mean, economics is a flawed science. It doesn't have to be, but when you use stuff like GDP, then you're just leaving out too much. Like you almost can't say anything. It's almost not even useful to use GDP, because what are you saying? So that's my opinion. I do think there are some indices in economics that give you a more fair comparison, but GDP and GDP per capita are not those.
The Department of Statistics we were discussing prior is not an independent department. And how does that shape the information that's allowed to be created by St. Martin? Because I think a lot of times, I mean, I've also been in conversations where people would say like, oh, but you have this one entity that's creating data and it's so government owned and or controlled. And of course, like, I think people have like this natural, or not have a natural tendency towards, but it is a leftist kind of idea to have like this inane distrust in government. And so then I would understand why people have also this distrust in the information that's released. But indeed, you can't take for granted what data is a government going to allow to be released about itself and the conditions that it's creating. Why does St. Martin not have a poverty line? Why do we not have information about the living wage? All this information would give us so much of a better insight into how to create better policy to address things like poverty. We can say poverty exists in St. Martin, but to what extent? And what are people lacking in? People may have like a roof over their heads, but they can't account for things in other areas. And until we get that kind of information, how do you advance, I think, the economic structural inequalities that we have within our society?
I think it comes down to political will. It's like, do people want to improve the things that need to be improved? Because if you do, like, you're really going about it the wrong way. Like it's there's so much that needs to be done just in terms of collecting simple data and statistics. Like St. Martin does not have good indications of where we are, and it's annoying that you have all of these like investor indices for people to, like, okay, like if you invest this much and you get this, and like you, so all of those statistics are on point. But then when it comes to socioeconomic indicators, like those are non-existent, you know, and then we're trying to do GDP. Like that's not okay. And so it's I feel like priorities are just all over the place right now. And I agree, the Department of Statistics does need to be an independent body, because it just does, and it needs to be unaffected by all of the government instability as well. Yeah, so I mean, statistics was one of the huge cornerstones of his capacity development um, issue. That was like the little puzzle piece that he had. But moving on, let's talk about a little bit of his solution. So his solution was strengthening resilience. That is the way that he sees that we can combat the two different shocks that St. Maarten experiences, right? And so that strengthening resilience, he divided that into three different parts. The first part is economic diversification. And he talked a little bit about that. He said economic diversification is actually not super feasible in the short term. And so what he sees as being more feasible in the short term is diversifying our tourism source market, because more than 50% of our tourists come from the US. And so he's saying, okay, like every time the US has a shock, then St. Maarten has a shock. So why not spread out where your tourists are coming from? And I think that's a super fair point, because economic diversification is not going to happen in the short term, but we need to plan for it and we need to make the steps so that it does happen. But in the short term, we can get a better tourism product, because all this building hotels in every beach is not going to work. And we can diversify our source market. I definitely agree with that. But then, right, where are we going to get tourists from? So I would love to increase the amount of pull that we have amongst Caribbean nationals. They're literally our neighbors. It is right there. I just think that we should have more interaction between the Caribbean islands. I think that we should have daily flights going to different Caribbean islands. It should be super easy to travel in the Caribbean. I don't know why we don't do that. I don't know why that's not a thing, right? I mean, Europe has clearly got the drift, right? Like, I mean, you can get a flight from Paris to Amsterdam for less than 50 euros, you know, like it's super cheap to travel from city to city, from country to country. The Caribbean, we can definitely implement something like that, but the political will is not there. And then talking about political will, we can touch on something we talked about a couple episodes ago, which is the Franco-Dutch Treaty, right? So because of the Franco-Dutch Treaty, we can't just say like, oh, we want to bring Caribbean nationals, because those same Caribbean nationals we want to bring to stimulate our economy are going to need visas. And I gave the example, I have a friend in Anguilla who is a Guyanese national, and he wants to visit St. Maarten. But for him to visit St. Maarten from Anguilla, he needs to travel to Trinidad to go to the Dutch consulate in Trinidad to get a visa to go back to Angola to travel to St. Maarten. Like, I mean, think about this, right? Like, think about this. These are the things that our Caribbean nationals have to go through in order to travel to St. Maarten. And so that's not even feasible in terms of diversifying our tourism product or our tourism source market with Caribbean nationals, because of all the red tape we send them to go through, right? So what does that mean? We're gonna have to go to Europe, right? And I mean, it's gonna be the same type of tourism that we've always been, you know, so it's like, it's not really anything, I don't know, different or something that can boost us in a way that will kind of like turn tourism on its head a little bit. Because I do think that the tourism product we have right now is just dated. But that's a different story. And then he also talked about improving population literacy in things like insurance. And I think that's so interesting that he mentioned that as an important thing that we need to do, because financial literacy on the island is bad. It is bad. And so improving that and having the capacity to absorb those improvements, I think is going to be really interesting in terms of like, okay, like where would you even start with a program like that, like implementing those in schools, or are you going to create like a whole new like institution for it, or is it like public classes, or what does that even look like? And then so people actually understand the importance of financial literacy. I don't know if they do. From there, he talked about capacity development, and that was his main point. His main point was that St. Maarten does not have the capacity to deal with these types of shocks.
But how can you do capacity development and statistics and worry about what social economic index you want if you're busy like keeping the lights on and making sure that the new government is well aware of everything, you know?
It is like such a shame, of course, that we had these two things that hit us. Of course, like when you're on your way to trying to establish yourself institutionally and politically. And so we see the way in which over the past 10 years, in receiving external shocks that we were not able to control, the way our internal management was also not set up to be able to manage it, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think last week in talking about the institutions and the way that we set them up, I think that that's part of it, recognizing how this all fits together for people to realize that, you know, it is the way that you manage your institutions politically that allows you to be ready for when these things happen, for you to bounce back easier.
That was my big takeaway as well. How do we capacity build now? You know, like it's definitely needed. It's definitely, I agree with him that that's, you know, that's the thing that we really are gonna need moving forward, but it's like, how?
And I don't want to only point fingers towards the Netherlands, but Mr. Richardson did mention in the first episode of the series, of the lecture series, that the colonial powers have a duty to prepare their colonies to independence because that is the ultimate goal. And so my question would be, why weren't we prepared? Why this capacity building didn't happen before 10 so that we can like start like, well, St. Maarten can start well in their direction with the right capacity from jumpstart basically. But now it hasn't been done. It's been 10 years. So yeah, how do we do it now basically?
And then, okay, I mean, I know we're trying to close off, but like even at that point, you know, like even in the things that the Netherlands is now demanding, you know, so after Irma, there were demands that had to be met in order to get funding. After the pandemic, well, not after, we're in a pandemic, but there are demands to get funding. Like, why are the demands not in terms of capacity building? You know, like I feel like that's not really what's being demanded. Like no one's demanding like you guys need better statistics. Like that's not this, they're not saying like, oh, separate your Department of Statistics. That needs to be independent. You know, it's like a lot of the demands are really like
Cater towards corruption.
yeah, you know, towards corruption, but they're also like, in my opinion, the demands are not really setting up St. Maarten necessarily for future success. It's setting up St. Maarten for more surveillance, you know? And I'm just like, but like, are our institutions better off at the end of the day? Like, I'm really seeing the demands for the improvement in infrastructure, because our infrastructure is weak, you know? Like, where are those? So I don't know. So to me, it's still like not really preparing us to stand on our own. It's preparing us for oversight. And so I don't know, that also doesn't sit well.
But I mean, it's also like where we have to push ourselves, right? Because I think, I mean, there's one part of it whereas, I mean, they are governing from what they think is like the perfect position, right? In the Netherlands. I mean, they have budget surpluses, whatever. And of course, they're going to think that possibly the same path to reach there for us is the one that they took. And that their rule book is suddenly going to lead to the same outcomes down here. And that's never the case, you know. And it's for us to also understand, I think, is sometimes we take all of these institutions and we take like a lot of legislation because we had the chance to write new legislation for 10-10-10. And what did we do? We copy and pasted Netherlands Antilles laws from the Netherlands, whatever, to shape and put over our reality. And no one ever asked, okay, like what is our reality here in St. Maarten? You know, like what are our economic needs? What are our social needs, political needs? And how do institutions rise from that in order to say like, we live here, we know what our problems are. And then kind of we point a finger and at the Dutch and say like, oh, but they don't see it, but we see it. So what are we doing about it when we see it? And that's my major thing. It's also for us to ask ourselves, like, where are we going? I think a lot of times we say like government doesn't have this or government doesn't have that. And it's sad that the push, especially in terms of the economy, always has to come from the private sector. But maybe now is just the point that as private sector, they realize that that's their strength of coming together and pushing the economy forward, even when we see that there's like a lack of leadership in the places that we want to see it. And that's something that St. Maarten has heavily benefited off for decades. Private sector pulling up their socks and saying, you know, we are going to push things forward. And I think that that's something that we can see. I have no data to to show, but hopefully there will one day be the data to show, you know, private sector did their thing here on St. Maarten and really was the one to bounce back our economy after certain setbacks.
And on that note, we will see you guys very soon. Thank you so much for tuning in with us. This was Mèlé. This was our second episode of our collaboration with USM, talking about St. Maarten after 10-10-10. All right, see you.